January 1944. High above central Germany, the winter air is thin and sharp. At 25,000 feet, the sky is crowded with silver shapes, American bombers moving in rigid formation, their contrails cutting white scars across the blue. German radar stations have already sounded the warning. Fighters scramble. Engines roar to life. Inside the cockpit of a Luftwaffe interceptor, a German pilot scans the horizon. He has seen this before. For months, U.S. bombers have come deep into the Reich, but only so far. He expects the escorts to turn back near the border, as they always have. That has been the pattern. That has been the weakness. But today, something is wrong. American fighters are still there, not thinning out, not turning away. They fly alongside the bombers with calm discipline, fuel tanks glinting under their wings. As the German pilot closes in, the escorts peel toward him, not defensively, but aggressively. They are not protecting. They are hunting. In that moment, disbelief spreads faster than fear. The rules of the air war have changed, and Germany's last safe assumption has just disappeared. This shock in the winter skies did not come suddenly. It was a result of years of doctrine, loss, and relentless American. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, its air strategy was already shaped by ideas formed long before Pearl Harbor. American planners believed that modern, heavily armed bombers could fight their way to targets in daylight, relying on tight formations and concentrated defensive fire. This belief was not reckless optimism. It was doctrine, taught in air schools and reinforced by interwar theory. Precision bombing, conducted under clear skies, would destroy factories, rail yards, and oil facilities while avoiding the civilian devastation seen in earlier conflicts. By 1942, that doctrine was tested over occupied Europe. The 8th Air Force began flying daylight missions from England, striking targets in France, the Low Countries, and eventually Germany itself. Early operations seemed to confirm American confidence. Bombers reached their objectives. Losses were serious but acceptable. German fighters often engaged briefly before breaking off under heavy machine gun fire. Yet there was an unspoken boundary in the sky. American fighters, primarily the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, could not escort bombers all the way to distant targets deep inside Germany. Their range, even with external fuel tanks, was limited. They protected the bombers to a point, then turned back. Beyond that line, the bombers flew alone. German commanders noticed quickly. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had adapted its tactics to exploit this weakness. Fighters waited beyond escort range, conserving fuel and strength. When the American escorts peeled away, German pilots attacked in coordinated waves, head-on passes, rocket salvos, and mass cannon fire. The bombers' defensive formations, once considered nearly impregnable, began to break apart under sustained assault. The limits of American doctrine became brutally clear in the summer and autumn of 1943. The Schweinfurt, Regensburg missions in August and October were meant to cripple Germany's ball-bearing industry, a vital component of its war production. Instead, they revealed the cost of daylight bombing, without continuous fighter protection. On October 14, 1943, later known as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured. Entire crews vanished from the sky. For German pilots, these battles reinforced a growing confidence. They were outnumbered, but they had geography and timing on their side. The Reich's industrial heartland lay beyond the reach of American fighters. Bombers could be bled until the offensive became unsustainable. Inside the U.S. Army Air Forces, the debate intensified. Some argue for shifting entirely to night bombing, as the British Royal Air Force had done. Others insisted the doctrine could still work, if the escort problem could be solved. The issue was not courage or training. It was physics. Engines consumed fuel. Fighters could only fly so far. Meanwhile, American industry was accelerating at a scale Germany could not match. Aircraft factories expanded. Production lines refined designs continuously. Losses in Europe did not slow output. They increased urgency. Engineers, logisticians, and commanders worked simultaneously on the same question: how to carry protection as far as the bombers needed to go. German intelligence watched these developments with cautious interest, but little alarm. Previous American fighters had always fallen away before reaching the deepest targets. The Luftwaffe believed this pattern would continue. Their pilots trained for it. Their tactics depended on it. What neither side fully grasped in 1943 was that the solution was already taking shape, not as a single invention, but as a combination of engine performance, fuel management, and a change in how fighters were meant to fight. As the bomber losses mounted and pressure grew in Washington and London, the air war over Europe approached a turning point, one that would quietly erase the last sanctuary German pilots believed they still possessed. By late 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign stood at a crossroads. The objective remained unchanged: to dismantle Germany's capacity to wage war by striking its industrial core. But the cost of reaching those targets without continuous fighter protection had become impossible to ignore. Each unescorted mission drained not only aircraft and crews, but confidence in the strategy itself. The answer would not come from a single decision or sudden breakthrough. It emerged gradually, shaped by industrial capacity, engineering pragmatism, and a willingness to abandon earlier assumptions. The U.S. Army Air Forces began to rethink the role of escort fighters. Initially, fighters were expected to stay close to bomber formations, acting as defensive shields. Their task was to intercept attackers, not pursue them. This conservative approach limited their effectiveness and wasted what little range they had. As losses mounted, commanders began to ask a different question. What if fighters were allowed to range freely, using speed and altitude to dominate the airspace ahead of the bombers? At the same time, engineers focused on extending range without sacrificing performance. External fuel tanks became standard rather than experimental. Drop tanks, once considered expendable luxuries, were refined, standardized, and mass-produced. Fuel management procedures were rewritten. Pilots were trained to think in terms of miles and minutes, not just dogfighting tactics. The most critical development, however, involved an aircraft that had already flown before the war had even reached its peak. The North American P-51 Mustang had been designed originally for the British, but early versions suffered from limitations at high altitude. That changed when the aircraft was fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built in the United States under license. The result was a fighter with exceptional range, high-altitude performance, and speed. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back, something no previous American fighter could reliably achieve. By December 1943, Mustangs were arriving in operational numbers. Their introduction did not immediately alter German expectations. The Luftwaffe had seen new Allied aircraft before. What mattered was not the model, but whether it would disappear at the edge of German airspace like the others. It did not. In early 1944, American escort tactics shifted decisively. Fighters were no longer tethered tightly to bomber boxes. They were sent ahead, above, and beyond the formations. Their mission expanded from protection to destruction. German fighters were engaged before they could organize attacks. Airfields, assembly points, and climbing interceptors became targets. For German pilots, this was deeply unsettling. Engagements no longer occurred on predictable terms. American fighters appeared earlier and stayed longer. Fuel, once a carefully conserved advantage, became a liability as Luftwaffe aircraft were forced into repeated climbs and evasive maneuvers. Behind the scenes, American production made these tactical shifts possible. Fighters lost over Germany were replaced quickly. New pilots arrived continuously, trained under standardized programs that emphasized discipline over individual flair. German training pipelines, already strained, could not keep pace. By the opening months of 1944, the air war had transformed in ways German commanders had not anticipated. The Reich was no longer protected by distance alone. The bombers' escorts now crossed the same skies, over the same cities, and stayed until the fight was finished. And as American fighters pushed deeper into German airspace, the stage was set for a confrontation that would decide who truly controlled the skies over Europe. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came not from reports or statistics, but from the reactions of the men in the air. German fighter pilots had grown accustomed to a rhythm. American bombers arrived with escorts. The escorts turned back. The fight began. It was dangerous, but it was familiar. In early 1944, that rhythm vanished. From a human perspective inside Luftwaffe cockpits, the presence of American fighters deep over Germany created a quiet shock. Pilots climbing to intercept expected resistance near the frontiers, not over the heart of the Reich. Instead, they found Mustangs already circling at altitude, waiting. The sense of control, carefully built through months of tactical experience, began to erode. This shift carried immediate tactical consequences. Escort fighters were no longer passive guardians. They operated aggressively, intercepting German formations before they could assemble. Head-on attacks against bombers became far riskier when escorts attacked from above and behind. German pilots who once focused on bomber formations now had to watch the sky in every direction. The technological angle was just as decisive. The P-51 Mustang's performance altered the geometry of air combat. Its speed allowed it to choose when to engage and when to disengage. Its range allowed it to remain over target areas long after previous escorts would have turned back. Drop tanks extended endurance without compromising combat ability once discarded. German aircraft, optimized for short, intense interceptions, faced a different problem. Repeated climbs drained fuel and engines. Engagements were no longer brief encounters near bomber streams, but prolonged contests that stretched resources thin. Even experienced pilots found themselves landing with empty tanks or damaged aircraft after fighting far from their bases. For American bomber crews, the change was visible and immediate. Escorts remained in sight longer. Fighter silhouettes appeared on the horizon even after targets were bombed. The constant fear of being left alone began to fade, replaced by cautious confidence. Missions remained deadly, but survival felt more attainable. Leadership decisions reinforced this transformation. U.S. commanders encouraged fighter pilots to press the advantage. Escorts were permitted and later instructed to pursue German fighters aggressively. This broke with earlier doctrine but reflected a growing understanding. Air superiority could not be achieved by defense alone. German command struggled to adapt. Fighter units were ordered to engage despite rising losses. Veteran pilots were lost at a rate that training schools could not replace. New pilots arrived with fewer flight hours and less combat preparation, entering a sky increasingly dominated by experienced Allied escorts. Psychologically, the impact was severe. German pilots began to describe a sense of being hunted rather than hunting. American fighters seemed always present, always waiting. The air above Germany no longer belonged exclusively to the Reich. Yet, this was only the beginning. As encounters multiplied and losses mounted, the broader implications of deep escort penetration became impossible to ignore, both for the Luftwaffe and for the Allied leadership directing the air war. The next phase of this transformation would push beyond individual encounters, reshaping command decisions, pilot training, and the moral weight carried by those fighting above a nation under constant bombardment. Beyond the cockpit, the arrival of long-range American escorts forced a reevaluation at every level of the German war effort. What began as a tactical problem quickly became a leadership crisis. Luftwaffe commanders had built their air defense strategy on interception zones and predictable bomber routes. With escorts now reaching deep into the Reich, those zones collapsed. From a command perspective, the pressure was relentless. German leaders were compelled to commit fighters earlier and in greater numbers, often without adequate coordination. Airfields that once served as secure staging areas were now vulnerable. American fighters strafed runways, destroyed aircraft on the ground, and disrupted takeoffs. Each sortie cost fuel, machines, and trained men Germany could no longer replace easily. The leadership contrast was stark. While German commanders reacted to immediate threats, American leadership focused on sustainability. Fighter tactics were standardized, refined, and distributed across units. Pilot survival was prioritized alongside mission success. This created a cumulative advantage that extended beyond individual battles. The enemy perspective also shifted. German pilots no longer viewed American escorts as temporary obstacles. They became the primary threat. This altered engagement behavior. Pilots aborted missions earlier. Formations broke apart under pressure. The cohesion that had once allowed effective interception deteriorated. There was also a moral dimension to this transformation. German pilots flew above cities increasingly exposed to uninterrupted bombing. The sight of escorts remaining over targets meant there would be no relief, no window where bombers flew unchallenged only briefly. The destruction below was no longer something that could be limited by intercepting unprotected formations. Air defense was failing in plain view. For American pilots, the burden was different but equally heavy. Escort missions required endurance and discipline. Fighters flew long hours, often without engaging the enemy, maintaining vigilance over hostile territory. When combat came, it was sudden and unforgiving. The distance from friendly bases meant damaged aircraft had little margin for error. Training reflected this reality. American pilots were drilled in fuel management, formation discipline, and mutual support. Individual heroics were discouraged in favor of teamwork. This approach contrasted sharply with the Luftwaffe's early war emphasis on individual skill, which became harder to sustain as losses mounted. By mid-1944, the cumulative effect of deep escort penetration was unmistakable. German air defenses thinned. Interceptions grew less frequent and less coordinated. American fighters began to dominate not only bomber routes but the surrounding airspace. This dominance did not arrive in a single decisive battle. It emerged gradually, mission by mission, loss by loss. Each escort that returned safely reinforced the new reality. Each German pilot loss represented experience that could not be replaced. As this imbalance widened, the air war approached a decisive moment, one where control of the skies would no longer be contested but decided.